When did Jesus say he would return? Most Christians believe that the timing of the second coming is unknowable, that it's going to be a complete surprise. But is that really what the Bible teaches? Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled, and today I'm going to be talking about the timing of the second coming, per Jesus and the apostles. To understand the timing of the second coming, we need look no further than Jesus' own words. Jesus' statements tell us everything we need to know. And Jesus spoke plainly enough so that the people of his day, many of whom were fishermen and farmers and merchants, they could easily grasp his meaning, at least if they wanted to. In fact, Jesus' apostles were, for the most part, average men with ordinary jobs, not trained theologians. 7 were likely fishermen, 1 was a tax collector, 1 was a zealot or a political revolutionary. Now, it's true that the Apostle Paul was trained in theology, but he was the exception. Point is this: if Jesus' first century followers could understand his words and concepts, so can we. So don't let anybody try to convince you otherwise. Okay, so as you consider Jesus' statements, which I'm going to read in a second, keep in the forefront of your mind that Jesus said these things during his earthly ministry, which began in the year AD 30 and ended in the year AD 33, approximately. AD is short, by the way, for in the year of our Lord. It's from the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which is, again, means in the day of our Lord. So, again, this timing, AD 30 to AD 33, which is when Jesus' ministry was, it may be off a few years one way or the other. There are different opinions regarding the exact date of Jesus' birth, or at what age he began his ministry, and the exact length of his ministry. But any possible variance is irrelevant to this discussion, because a few years one way or the other won't make any difference to any of the arguments that I'm going to present. So therefore, to keep things simple, let's just say 1, Jesus was born in the year AD 1, which is what our modern calendars are based on. And then 2, Jesus began his ministry at 30 years old, which is generally the scholarly consensus. And then 3, Jesus was crucified about 3 years later, which again is the scholarly consensus. So in other words, Jesus' earthly ministry began in the year AD 30 and ended in around AD 33. Okay? So this date and others will be highlighted all through this video. I mean, I'm going to highlight these dates over and over because knowing when these events happened is crucial to understanding the timing of the second coming, as you're going to see in a minute. So that said, be careful not to confuse the timing of the statements and the events with the dating of authorship. In other words, when the New Testament books or letters were written. For example, let me give you an example. The Gospel of Matthew records events from Jesus' birth in about the year AD 1 to his death, resurrection, and ascension in about the year AD 33. However, most scholars say Matthew was probably not written until the year AD 50. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so now let me read 4 important time indicators about the second coming. These are all from the book of Matthew, by the way. Okay, so let's see. The first one is Matthew 16, verses 27 through 28. And this is Jesus talking. He says, "For the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. I say to you," and Jesus is talking to his first century audience, "I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So Jesus is telling the people right in front of them that they will not taste death, or in other words, they will not all die till they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So obviously it had to happen in their lifetimes, right? Here's another passage. This is Matthew 10:23. Jesus is talking to his apostles. He says, "But whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next, for surely I tell you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes." In this passage, Jesus is just about to send his apostles out to go, preaching throughout the cities. And he says, you will not finish going throughout the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. So in other words, it's going to happen. And by the way, Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So how long does it take to get through New Jersey? It had to happen shortly before they even made it across those cities throughout Israel. Okay, here's another passage. This is on the Mount of Olives, about a week before Jesus' crucifixion. He's talking to his disciples, and they're sitting by the temple, looking at the temple, and Jesus says, assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. They will see the Son of Man come in on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So, once again, Jesus is saying that the Son of Man will come in the clouds, the temple will be destroyed, and all these things will happen before this generation passes away. So once again, we have the exact same timing before his audience passes away, before the generation he was talking to passes away. By the way, a biblical generation is about 40 years. Okay, so here's one more passage. This is after Jesus' arrest. He's talking to Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin, and he says, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So once again, he's telling his audience, Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Jewish Sanhedrin, that they will see him sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So in each of these passages, Jesus in the year AD 30 said he would come again within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to. In Matthew 16, he said he would come before his audience passed away. In Matthew 10, he said he would come before his apostles finished preaching throughout the cities of Israel. Again, a country about the size of New Jersey. In Matthew 24, Jesus said he'd come within the generation, which the Bible defines as 40 years. And by the way, you can look this up in Hebrews 3, verse 8 through 10, or Numbers 14, verses 30 through 34, or Nehemiah 9, 21. I'm not going to read these passages, but you can look them up if you're interested. A generation is about 40 years. And then lastly, in Matthew 26, Jesus told Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin that they would see him coming on clouds. And all four of these passages, Jesus essentially says the same thing, which is that he would come on clouds within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to. Since all these four statements give the exact same fulfillment time frame, we can be confident that the timing indicators are not figures of speech or hyperbole. Jesus meant them exactly how they sound. In fact, these statements interpret one another. If we had only one of them, right, a person might have a legitimate reason for, not being overly dogmatic as to whether, to take the timing aspect literally or not, but not with all four together. It's clear from the four statements that Jesus meant it exactly how it sounds in each of the statements. Jesus clearly believed he would come again within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to. Now, while he did not know the exact day and hour, as he said in Matthew 24:36, he certainly knew it would happen within the lifetimes or generation of the people that he was talking to, because he said so repeatedly. Since all these four statements give the same fulfillment time frame, we can also be confident they refer to the same event. In fact, if Jesus believed that there was going to be another coming besides this one, a third coming, if you will, it's baffling why he would have neglected to mention it in any of these passages. This would have been the perfect time to do so, especially Matthew 24, where Jesus and the disciples specifically talk about the end. And you can see that in Matthew 24, verses 3, 13, and 14. So they talk about the end, yet Jesus says nothing about another coming, a third coming. Now, granted, this is an argument from silence, but the silence is deafening. The writer of Hebrews also confirms this in saying he will appear a second time, and he's talking about Jesus. He will appear a second time. This is, by the way, Hebrews 9:28 says he will appear a second time, not a third time. Neither Jesus nor the apostles ever mentioned a third coming, and they never mentioned future comings, plural, either, as of expecting more than one. Plus, when giving timing indicators, Jesus and the apostles repeatedly said it would happen within the lifetime or generation of their audiences, just like in those four statements in Matthew above. In fact, even in this passage from Hebrews, which was written in around AD 60. The writer says that he would come in a little while, not in thousands of years. Here's what the passage says. Hebrews 10:37. For yet a little while, he who is coming will come and not tarry. So a little while is not thousands of years. This timing, by the way, because this was written in about AD 60. So this timing fits perfect with Jesus saying it would happen within a generation. Now, keep in mind, Jesus' second coming is markedly different than his various post-resurrection appearances, which are sometimes loosely referred to as comings by some commentators. For example, after his death and resurrection, Jesus appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus. You can see that in Acts 9, verse 4 and 5. Jesus also appeared to doubting Thomas in John 20, 26 through 29. Jesus also appeared to Peter in the vision of the sheet descending with the animals. You can see that in Acts 10, verse 13 through 15. Although these sorts of appearances and events are sometimes loosely referred to as comings, they are notably different than Jesus' second coming, which involves judgment, as I'm going to show in a minute. There is an interesting example of one of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances in which he also mentions the second coming. The event took place on the Sea of Tiberias during an unproductive day of fishing by the apostles. All of a sudden, Jesus appeared on the shore and told his disciples to cast the net on the other side of the boat. And when they did, the fishing net almost tore because of the amount of fish they caught. You guys probably remember that story. Later in that day, while Jesus ate fish with his apostles on the beach, he revealed that Peter would die a martyr's death. Peter then asked about John's fate, to which Jesus replied cryptically, "If I will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is in John 21:23. So Jesus tells Peter, if I will that John remains or stays alive, what is that to you? So while Jesus did not explicitly say, that John would remain alive until he comes, he sure hinted at it. And this timing, by the way, would not only fit perfectly with Jesus's other statements in Matthew and then also the statements in Hebrews, but it would also fit perfectly with what ended up happening. Historians affirm that only John lived, out of the apostles, lived to AD 70 when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed. The rest of the apostles, including Peter, were all martyred before then. And Judas, of course, hung himself. Now, is this a coincidence? I think not. It's pretty obvious what Jesus meant here. Okay, so consider another telling aspect of Jesus' four statements in Matthew. Jesus used the second person plural you as opposed to they. For example, in Matthew 10, he said, you, and he's talking to his apostles, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man come. Right? He didn't say they, like as if he's talking about people thousands of years away. He said you. Likewise, in Matthew 24, Jesus uses the second person plural you 7 times. Like, you will see this, you will see that, you will see this. He never says they, as if he's talking to a group, far off, thousands of years later. And the same in Matthew 26, Jesus says to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, he says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on clouds of heaven. He doesn't say they will see, as if talking to, about a group far off. He says you. This is also, pretty good evidence that Jesus believed he would come within the lifetimes of the people he was addressing. Had he intended to come thousands of years later, he would have said, they will see me coming on clouds, and not you will see me coming on clouds. When reading the Bible, or any other book for that matter, we need to be careful not to overlook who is actually being spoken to. Some of the statements in the Bible were not meant for us. While all the statements in the Bible were preserved for us, they were not all spoken to us. For example, in Hosea 1:2, God says, go take for yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Now, was Hosea talking to all men of all time to go take for yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry? Of course not. He was talking to Hosea. He was making a point about Israel's unfaithfulness, and he used Hosea to make it. Same with Matthew 21:2. Jesus says, Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with a colt. Untie them and bring them to me. Obvious, Jesus is not talking to us. He was talking to his disciples back then, right? It's the same thing in those 4 statements in Matthew about Jesus when he's talking about a second coming. He was talking to people right in front of him. He wasn't talking to people thousands of years later. Automatically assuming that every Bible verse was spoken to us or meant for us without first considering who was being addressed makes about as much sense as overhearing a random conversation on the street between 2 people and assuming the speaker is talking to you. He isn't, and neither was Jesus. To interpret the Bible correctly, we must not overlook who was actually being spoken to. This vitally important hermeneutic or method of biblical interpretation is called audience relevance. Keep in mind, again, I'm going to say that just because Jesus' prophecies were not meant directly for us does not mean they are therefore irrelevant and unimportant to us. They are immensely important to us, just like the many other already fulfilled prophecies in the Old Testament. They confirm God's existence. They show how God worked through history. They show God's faithfulness, that he does what he says when he says he's going to do it. They also reveal God's wishes and desires for humanity. Such things are immensely important to us. But these prophecies were not intended directly for us. They were preserved for us, for our learning and edification and the building up of our faith, but they were not meant directly to us. Consider also the significance of Jesus' 4 statements in Matthew. These were not just ordinary statements. These were prophecies. Prophecies belong in the same category as miracles. They belong in the same category as raising the dead or feeding 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish or healing a blind man and any other miracles. In the same way, these other supernatural signs and wonders validated God's true spokesman, so did fulfilled prophecies. Since only God knows the future with certainty and detail, therefore only someone truly in communication with God can accurately foretell the future with detail. Fulfilled prophecies validate the prophets who uttered them, and they confirm that the prophets or apostles were in fact men of God, especially prophecies of the magnitude that Jesus uttered in those 4 statements in Matthew. Jesus intentionally put himself out on a limb as if to say to his first century critics, in addition to all the miracles I did in your presence during my 3.5-year ministry, which prove I'm the Messiah, I'm also going to put a big exclamation point on it by coming on the clouds of glory, and it's going to happen within your generation. So either it happened, which means Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be, or it didn't, which means Jesus is a false prophet. The test of a false prophet is whether or not his prophecy comes to pass. Here's what Deuteronomy 18 says. This is God speaking, and he says, "And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken?" When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if that thing does not happen or come to pass, that is a thing which the Lord has not spoken. This is in Deuteronomy 18, verse 21 and 22. In fact, if Jesus did not come on clouds within a generation or by approximately 80, 70, then killing him was justified. Deuteronomy 18 goes on to say, "But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." The reason why God judged false prophets so harshly is because they claimed to be speaking for him. God's reputation was on the line, and he didn't want it squandered away by charlatans and wannabes. Plus, God did not want false prophets muddying up his message and causing confusion among his people and competing with his true spokesman. So the penalty for false prophecy under the Old Covenant was death. And Jesus knew this well, as his repeated warnings about false prophets show. You can see that in Matthew 24, verse 4 to 5, or Matthew 24, verse 23 to 25. Jesus repeatedly spoke about false prophets, so he never would have made those 4 prophecies in Matthew unless he expected to come within the generation of the people he was addressing. Okay, so I want to close this video by showing you some clear time statements by Jesus' apostles that show that they too expected Jesus to come within their generation or by the year AD 70. Okay, so as you look at these passages, Notice how the urgency increases as the year AD 70 approaches. Okay, so the first passage I want to read is 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 15. This was written, by the way, in about the year AD 51 or 52. And this is Paul or the apostles talking to the Thessalonians. And he says, "For this we say to you," and we here is the apostles. So for this we apostles say to you, Thessalonians, by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who have fallen asleep or died. So Paul is essentially saying here that there will be some in that audience who will still be alive when the Lord comes, right? Paul is essentially echoing what Jesus had said 20 years earlier. Remember the passage I quoted earlier where Jesus said, "There are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming." This is from Matthew 16:28. Paul is essentially saying the same thing. Paul says, "We who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord," versus Jesus saying, "There are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming." Same thing. Okay, so here's another passage. This is Paul in AD 57. He says, "The time is short." Okay, and then here's Paul again in AD 57. This is 1 Corinthians 10:11. It says, "Now all these things happened to them," and he's talking about the Israelites back in Moses' day, 1,500 years earlier. So he says, "Now these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." So Paul believed the end of the ages have come. And by the way, the end of the ages is the end of the Old Covenant age, basically had come. Okay, here's another passage. Paul says in the year AD 58, he says, "The night is far spent, the day is at hand." And the day here, he's talking about the day of the Lord. The night is far spent. In other words, it's about over, and the day of the Lord is at hand. Here's another passage. This is James in about the year 61 or 62. He says, "The coming of the Lord is at hand. The judge is standing by the door." So it's about to happen. Here's Paul talking in AD 62 or 63. He says, "The Lord is at hand." In other words, the Lord was about to come. In AD 62, here's a passage from Hebrews. I already read this passage, but it's worth reading again. The writer of Hebrews, which is probably Paul. Most commentators think it's Paul. But anyway, whoever it was said, "To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation." So, this is talking about Jesus' second coming. And then the writer of Hebrews goes on to say in the next chapter, "For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and not tarry." In other words, it was about to happen, a little while, right? And then here's another passage. Peter, this time, says in the year AD 63, "They will give an account to him," and they're talking about Jesus. He's talking about Jesus. And he says, "Who is ready to judge the living and the dead." So by this time, AD 63, Jesus was ready to judge the living and the dead. Okay, here's another passage by Peter. He says in the year AD 63, "The end of all things is at hand." And basically what he's talking about, the end of the Old Covenant age is at hand. And at the end of the Old Covenant age is when Jesus comes. Okay, here's John this time in the year AD 65 approximately. He says, "It is the last hour." So it's not even the last day anymore. It's the last hour of the last day. In other words, Jesus is about to come. Here's another passage. This is Jesus talking in the year AD 65. By the way, he's talking through an angel. If you remember, he passed away, he was crucified, and then he ascended back in the year AD 33 approximately. And this is Jesus talking through an angel in the book of Revelation. And he says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. The time is at hand." In other words, Jesus was about to come by this time. So it's evident from these statements that the apostles were just repeating what Jesus had taught them. Namely, that he would come on clouds within a generation, or by about the year 8070. The difference is that by the time these later New Testament books were written, it was getting progressively closer to that day. So the urgency kept increasing, right? Instead of Jesus coming within a generation, which he had said back in 8030, by now, by 8065, Jesus said he was coming quickly, for the time was at hand. And at hand doesn't mean 2,000 years. At hand means it's about to happen. So Jesus must have come shortly after he said this. And by the way, there's evidence that he did. The first century Josephus said the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in the year 8070. 1.1 million Jews were killed. Another 97,000 were taken into captivity. Jesus came on clouds in judgment just like he had promised, within a generation or by the year 8070. Okay, so that's it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. I know it goes against what many Christians believe, but I don't think there's any way around the clear teachings of sacred scripture. And by the way, for more about this subject, the second coming and end time related stuff, you can go to the website, thebiblefulfilled.com, and read my article, The Reason for the Second Coming. I go into, much more detail about this topic. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button to make it easier for other people to find on the internet, on Google. Also, if you want to be notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button. And lastly, keep an eye out for my book called The End is Here, which will be out in a couple months. It's all about end times issues, like the second coming, the new heaven and earth, the last days, resurrection, and much more. All kinds of eschatological issues I go over. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. I will see you on the next one.